I think that her was an interesting choice to illustrate the notion of frustration. And maybe we should start off, as Sonia was pointing out, to sort of brainstorm a little bit about what we consider frustration to be, as in our analytical world, but also, I'd say, in layman's terms. This idea of adversity and having to go through these different types of difficulties that we may experience at the same time on a very real level and also on an emotional level, things that are difficult and that cause pain. I would put frustration on the same level as displeasure, opposing it to pleasure, and as well as the idea of well, castration, obviously, which is going to be part of castration anxiety, but not just the phallic castration as we may commonly refer to castration, but in the idea of really this notion of what needs to oppose pleasure principle, displeasure and pleasure having to be combined in order to exist in the actual reality.
The level of frustration is also important depending on the individual. So in a way, there is some sort of like optimal frustration that really helps the person grow by overcoming. Like that would be probably like what we often call like challenge. But then there is the traumatic frustration. That's the one that the individual sees that he or she does not have the power to overcome, and that causes trauma.
Well, that's a very good point. And I think in terms of traumatic frustration, we have to really go back then to psychodynamic theory and understand that what will become traumatic effect is going to be the overriding of the psyche's ability to filter the information and digest it through the symbolization process. So a traumatic frustration isn't something that would be objective. It would be completely subjective in terms of the individual's ability to process it. And if the psyche is not prepared, so with the sufficient and adapted defense mechanisms, then obviously that is what's going to become the traumatic frustration that will be excessively violently override the psyche and cause the actual trauma. So that brings us back to our culture, our society, our environment in terms of how are we able or are we less able to sustain this frustration where simple things do become traumatic. Simple everyday events or challenges, you were saying, will become something that is traumatic because we're no longer able to develop the sufficient defense mechanisms.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, actually, that's why I'm like, thank you. I mean, this is exactly it, and that's why looking at it from the objective, like through an objective lens, really doesn't help, and that's mainly the problem with some manuals like DSM, for example, DSM-4, DSM-5, because they want to try to sort of have a set of like objective criteria to define trauma and say, okay, so if this is trauma, then this is PTSD. Other than that, it is not. But I mean, like, it really varies from an individual to the other.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yes, and we can see how this is what we encounter in our clinical practice, is we'll see how to some people, something like being on time, just their relationship with time or with obligation or responsibility becomes a traumatic situation, which should not in theory. But then that allows us to search for what is it in their construction that did not give them the ability to process this kind of displeasure so that it doesn't become traumatic.
Remarked in, well, in our society, it seems like we're completely in a climate where frustration has been eliminated through, well, through screens, through all of our information that we want, we get automatically. After, I think that creates a sort of incapability of withstanding and processing frustration. I see it in my patients coming towards me with any sort of anything that kind of just blocks them, there's just emotion of, sort of a surcharge of emotion, basically. It's, in each individual, it will manifest itself in different ways.
Mhm.
And so I particularly liked this movie because of the way it sort of reflected our society today as well.
Mhm. Christo, do you have a something specific you'd like to say about the particular cinematography of this film on about this topic?
As a filmmaker, I've always been interested working with actors, and I have training as an actor also. Creating the reality of a fictional character means you have to understand how they think and create a background, create a history, their dreams, their frustrations. So I've always been interested in your field, and I'm learning a lot just listening to you guys, going into at another level. Of course, I have to be careful because I don't have the vocabulary that you have. But what was interesting about that film, first of all, Spike Jonze, the director, is known to be very interested in psychoanalysis. All his films, whether it was Being John Malkovich or I forget, but his whole filmography has always been about mindfuck and going into your head and living another reality. And so the film Her is very interesting because, as we've all noticed, our society today is disconnecting from the reality of other human beings, and we're all living inside our heads. And then what is the reality that we can create, and how can we have the perfect companion, the perfect life? Today, we're all hearing about artificial intelligence. We're all hearing about, science fiction has always been interested in creating another reality that's better than the one we live in. How do you do that cinematically? How do you use cinematic language to go into people's heads to create that space where everybody is going to be able to have a story told, but stay each one of us in our little bubble? And I think Spike Jonze did a pretty good job at creating that atmosphere. The soundtrack is excellent, creating those empty spaces where the silence becomes so oppressive that he needs to communicate with an imaginary person, because when he's all alone, the city, the landscapes, his apartment is completely barren. His whole life sucks. He lives in LA, for God's sake. It's there's very little human interaction, and you barely talk to your neighbor. So they all feel the same way. That's why the film is very touching, because we can relate to that more or less, depending on where you live. Spike Jonze is very good at using the cinematography. Baron, the character's name is Twombly.
Yeah, Twombly.
Oh,
Cy Twombly is the artist that we all have heard of or not, which was the most minimal artist that exists when you go to a museum of modern art, and it's just one line on a wall, and everybody says, "What's going on?" And it's a mindfuck, because there are references to art history there, but when you look at it, you don't understand. And that's what he's trying to do in his films too. So it's always at different levels, which you guys interpret in a very interesting way. And I want to hear what you have to say.
wow, well, that's great. It's great to have that insight. I feel like I need to watch it again now and pay attention to the soundtrack. I don't think I noticed that at all.
It's the deafening silences that he goes through on his terrace, hoping to have some kind of alive. He's I mean, you don't know if he's going to jump off the balcony or not, and that's when you hear a drone in the background, and that's the drone that's it's like this hyper pitch, which we all use. I mean, in film, you bring the aigu, the high pitch sound to the maximum. So it's the kind of sound that freaks dogs out. The dogs freak out. Human beings can't really listen to hear it, but it scares teenagers. So that's why it's really efficient when you like. And I think North America, they have these devices outside of stores so that the teenagers don't hang out in the using. Spike Jonze has a history of doing all the MTV. He was famous for doing all the music video clips for many years before he became a feature filmmaker. He did the Beastie Boys, Bjork. He's very aware of sound.
Right. So he's really
Alphabet, which are images, colors, sound, editing, the rhythm. All the shots are all very slow. They all last 4 or 5 seconds longer than a regular film. So it brings this weight, this suffocating atmosphere that he's going through. And suddenly she comes, Samantha, the robot, comes into his life. And oh my God, we're all in love with her because there's no life except for this robot.
I was going to say I agree with Krista with the soundtrack. However, I focused in on these solo songs in the beginning. I guess it was of it's just one voice, a woman's voice, a little bit sharp and flat, and it just gives this hollow feeling of being completely on your own path, and reflected, as you said, Krista, those scenes on the terrace, kind of gray and smoggy. And I noticed the lack of color. I mean, his shirt was sort of a salmon color, a salmon red. It's the only color that really stood out. And at one point I saw blue. That was at the end, 3/4, almost to the end of the movie. I was like, okay, there's blue now. At the moment of his breakdown, but we'll get to that. But yeah, the color and the sound was something I really absorbed as well.
Design. His apartment he doesn't have a single book. He doesn't have anything on his walls. It's like being in God's waiting room. It's terrifying. It's terrifying. And it's all studied, of course. They all sat down and said, this is his environment.
So there's a good use of symbols, or here in this case, lack of symbols, to express the emptiness, the void of this character. The whole film is really based on this notion of emptiness. And I think we could also talk about desire. We were saying the want, we want, you get. The question of desire and how is it being transformed and expressed. His desire is to reconnect with his ex-wife, isn't it? He's unable, in his inability to sustain frustration, he's also unable to sustain separation, which is part of the, we could say, part of the symptoms, where he's stuck on his ex-wife, that separation that he doesn't seem to have actually be separated from, at least emotionally. Samantha becomes like a substitute on which he can project all of these desires, all of these wants, without having to compromise anything about himself. And I think that sort of ties into his profession of being writing fake love stories, or just the fake correspondence, that he puts a lot of creativity into that, but doesn't it reflect all of those desires that are on the level of the fantasy rather than something that is of a real mutual human relationship?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you and Christo. There is this disconnect, no doubt. I mean, he's disconnected from his own community, his neighbors, probably friends, and also separated from his wife. But there is also some sort of connection there, implicitly there, and that is connecting with someone, something, a concept that is ruling his life, and that's probably the concept that leads to alienation. Maybe in Lacanian parlance, that would be the big other. So I would like to differentiate that with superego. Some may see the two, when comparing the two theories, some believe that they are all almost identical. In in my humble opinion, they are not, because superego can actually be very helpful. When it becomes to the point that it gets to the point that superego is really strict, that's a harsh superego. Other than that, that's how children learn things from their parents. Whereas the big other is like a faceless system that controls things. So yes, this person is disconnected from his own community, separated from his wife, but also totally alienated, because his connections are all through the eyes or lens of the big other. The big other creates the system, being the phone or the thing that he's got with him, and he purchased that. The big other brings up the idea of, okay, you can make up your own operating system, OS system, and he's got his own operating system, and he starts interacting with them. So he's alienated in the sense that he's interacting with what is approved by what is outside of him. So he can reconnect, or he is reconnecting with him, trying to reconnect with himself through the lens of the other, big other, what is coming from the outside. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges of this person.
Well, to bounce off of that, yes, I think the superego is definitely something that's different, because it is malleable. It's something that can be changed and can be evolve, rather. And we're bordering on psychosis here. It's almost like we're talking about superego, which is part of the normally neurotic construction, and questioning the symbolic other, which means questioning this notion of reality principle, and how much all of this virtual reality and all of these virtual relationships are taking us, are deconstructing us as a society, in terms of bordering us towards psychosis, where there is no longer, we've replaced our own, the outside world rather, by our own inner fantasies that now becomes possible. Not only does it become possible, but it's so well done that we are all tricked into believing that that is real.
I had the feeling that his frustration, depression, this egg that he was living in, maybe had pushed him to the towards psychosis, as you just said, Delphine. And there's like the man who's at the reception, who comes over to him and he says, part of you is a woman. Inside of you, part of you is a woman. And I took that as a precursor, and it really made me start thinking that voice of Samantha in his head was his own voice, was his own head talking back. It was his own was his voice, part of him talking to him to appease himself.
Oh, yeah, okay.
He was in this depressive state, and then finally, when that is done, she leaves.
Oh, well, that's interesting. You're talking about narcissistic identification, which indeed would be part of the psychotic process.
Yeah,
it's amazing. I didn't see that at all, and I'm very disturbed by everything we're getting bombarded with the gender revolution, and how we're getting so many different voices and so many different arguments about whether it's legitimate to transition because you feel that inside of you are the opposite sex, or if it's just a phase, and if you let it. And so they're saying, it happens in adolescence, and quite often, if you let it, if you you're able to live through that difficult period, you will come out either gay or not, but not necessarily transitioning to the opposite sex. And so we're hearing all this, and now you're talking about this film with this voice inside of him, and I'm thinking, what happens to the teenagers, the adolescent, the children that hear this voice and have and are disconnected from their friends, from their society, because they're lost in video games? It's all related. somehow. It's quite terrifying.
Well, that's why sometimes we hear these horrible stories about teenagers committing suicide because of things that have been said to them on social media. And that takes the place. And they're not even people that they know, that they have ever met in their lives or ever will meet in their lives. It's this fantasized group of friends, which definitely is the wrong term for that, who become these voices. And there are so many of these voices. And again, I mean, we could talk about the schizo-paranoid position that this takes us back to, with multiple voices that we normally have the defense mechanisms to cope with these voices, which never become very conscious and are usually transformed, sublimated, etc., through the experience of life. And now it's less so, because there is, and I think again in her, it's very interesting to see how his neighbor, who is a potential real relationship, the friend, I believe she's a neighbor, he's not really paying attention to her, while she clearly is that opening towards something that would be reconnecting himself to his humanity, to his own self, his identity as a whole, which is completely fragmented in his character and through Samantha.
But that means what Maureen was mentioning is that the Samantha robot was able to help him in this period of mourning his divorce and creating this transition so that he opens up to his neighbor. Because at the end of the film, we kind of are led to believe that he is going to have a relationship with her, with the neighbor. He's finally opened up to another human being thanks to this fantasy relationship he had with the computer. How do you see that? As could it be something positive? Is this something we should look forward to?
Well, I guess anything is possible. We could look at the glass half full. I would tend to interpret this situation, on the contrary, as it being an obstacle. I think that the Samantha is part of his symptom, really. But you're right that ultimately it does transform into something, or at least we are led to believe that there is an issue, that there is an exit, there's a way out to his madness, really.
There was a key sentence there, I mean, about the marriage and separation. So the reason that he cannot really emotionally separate from that one, and like having other healthy relationships. Talking about his wife, his former wife, he says that she came from one of those families wherein nothing was ever good enough. So that person herself was coming from that background. So, and we know a lot about like the good enough parenting, good enough mothering from Winnicott's standpoint and books. So she herself, her former wife, had those very deep psychic splits, I would say. So the two could connect. He could connect there because it was just like feeding to that loop of psychic splitting. Whereas with another person, maybe a more high functioning one, that would be difficult for him. So he needed to go through that period, that phase, to be able to find himself, to overcome that split to some extent, at least, to be able to enter in a new relationship. So I think that the comment he made about his wife's family was really important.
The ending scene also, where Theodore writes the letter to Catherine, his ex, I feel is symbolically that he's finally able to renounce his depression, this inertia, this quagmire that it's almost like he's swimming in water the whole time. I felt oppressed watching the movie. I started to get frustrated in a way. And I was like, let's go, let's move it. I want some color, I want some life, I want some energy. And at the end, when he breaks up with Samantha and he's able to write that letter to his ex, just saying, always be in you somehow and around you. And there he says he loved this woman, and he was just hanging on. Finally, he signed the divorce papers at one point, and that was like, for me, again, kind of signaling the end of the movie, that, you know, he was edging towards that, towards action. And then at the end of that, the letter towards his wife, for me, was symbolically, okay, he's getting there. And he cried, and for me, it was like a sigh of relief.
He ends up accepting life as the mediocrity of life, because he's in his head most of the time mourning his divorce or his past relationship, and it's all filmed like an ad. It's all filmed in slow motion with people laughing and children and slow motion kisses, and it's all one big romanticized version of what his first wife was when he was happy. And then in the present he's miserable, and then he just settles for the next door neighbor, just in pajamas and socks, sitting on the sofa, and he's at peace with that. He's not in an ad anymore. He's in reality with another human being.
Well, it takes us back to our topic on frustration and ideals. We were talking about, Rhett had brought up the notion of superego, and so therefore ideals. The idealized parent, the idealized spouse, the idealized self. When we go through life, and that's what frustration is, I'd say the main purpose of frustration is to allow us to review these illusions. And though it's painful, of course, when we come to the understanding that the ideals cannot live confronted with the reality principle, but that also enables us to go back to our mediocre humanity. You were using that word in terms of, well, if the other, and so maybe even the symbolic other, if now that is no longer an idealized function, then it means that I do not have to identify with an idealized self as well. And that is really what the acceptance of frustration is, or the castration complex. That's what allows us afterwards to invest the libido in the genital stages.
And there is this question about the world today, like 21st century, thinking about how it is, and the ideals and perfectionistic views. Are these really helping people, given what you just said? I mean, exactly. I think they don't, actually.
No. It allows us to avoid disillusionment. However, disillusionment is what is needed for our individual growth and growth as a society. And instead, this society is going towards more avoidance of the reality principle and the disillusionments to maintain the ideals.
But in theory, sorry.
Oh, hi, Sonia.
I didn't mean to talk over you.
For me, the thing that keeps repeating is our ability to tolerate otherness, and our encounter with otherness as a limit, as the limit, the castrating limit. And a retreat into fantasy is not an encounter with another person. It's our own fantasy about that otherness. And so this seems to run through the whole picture for me, in terms of we retreat into our virtual worlds, and we create, it's basically just another fantasy, you know, an effort to avoid the encounter with the other, something that isn't us. Because when we encounter something different to us, it puts us in that place of we're not supreme. We are limited. We can't retain that ideal version of ourselves. And I'm just wondering what it is about our society that is reducing our ability to tolerate otherness. And I know we've probably had prejudices and bigotry around, since year dot, but it's really even in genders, in other people on a daily routine basis, we seem to avoid that position of you're different to me. There's lots of people saying how, we're moving towards the same, we have to be the same, and I just wonder what it is that is reducing our ability to deal with the world on this level. The good enough mother, maybe, I don't know. And kind of moving back to this point of castration, in terms of the capacity for it to be a traumatic experience or a enabling experience and a way of managing anxiety. What is it that positions us between those kinds of coordinates and locations and experiences? Yeah. So that's what's kind of repeating for me. And what do we think it is? Like, what do we think it is that's reducing our ability to navigate these things that we would have been able to do in the past to a better degree?
Well, I think the character is very well portrayed in the film, showing exactly what you're saying, Sonia. Where, for instance, it's almost like he's a child and going through education over again until he comes to, at the end, the acceptance of the other. We begin the film, he's playing video games, right? And we can see that he's getting frustrated very quickly. He's unable, his little character isn't moving the way he wants him to move. And it's making him very frustrated, and he gives up, and he throws it away and he gives up. So there are other symbols like that. His inability to go through an argument, even though Samantha is a virtual person, they would have arguments, and he had childish responses to these arguments where he would turn her off or punish her. You see these mechanisms that are very childlike in the inability to confront and to look at himself in a critical perspective. And then his possessiveness and jealousy when he discovers that Samantha actually has other clients and has invested other relationships, and that seems to be extremely difficult for him to accept that there would be others for her as well. So we can really see this binary relationship of our initial relationships as a child with his mother, and then not accepting the other, the separating element that takes us to elaborating better mechanisms and evolving as an adult in a mature way. So it seems like he's going throughout the whole film, his character is evolving from childhood through adolescence, and at the end, finally, there's a hope for adulthood somewhere in there, where he is recognizing, seeing the other, who is not him, who is different than him, where it is no longer based on that narcissistic identification. So that's a difficult process. I think that why is it difficult for us, Sonia? You were saying, I think the answer is simply because that is displeasure, and we function on the principle of pleasure, as our psyche goes towards pleasure, except that it's a learning process. It has to go through experience. It has to go through our experience of displeasure, of frustration, so that we find pleasure in what would be beyond that. But until then, our natural instinct is to avoid displeasure at all cost and regress to these child processes where we will find, again, the ultimate binary relationship.
And a lot of times in the world today, our environment actually provides us with the opportunity to do that, to
Yes.
actually to regress, or to say the least, at least not go past that point. So a lot of things, products, surgeries, video games, so many other things help the individuals at different age groups really to remain in the position that they are, or even at times regress, really. And that's I see this as unfortunate.
Ask a question. When we see the progression, so I also saw how it was a regression, and he acts like a child, and then he gets what he wants with the imaginary woman of his dreams. But what is, and I think it made me laugh tremendously. Where is this character in the video game that's insulting him coming from? Like, who in your world as psychoanalysis, what does that represent? This little character that just in his head is just completely out of control, insulting him. What's that?
And you have to mention the fact that he, in order to move forward, this little character is requiring to be insulted as well. He keeps insulting him until he insults him back, and that's when he says, "Come on, I'll show you the way out."
Yeah. But
so,
what is
good point? Yeah.
What in your world? How do you explain that character?
Different theories provide different perspectives, but one way we can look at it is from object relations theory and perspective. So basically, when the child individual internalizes the object, there are both aspects, although like good and bad, libidinal and aggressive. So they're both in there, and he may try to keep them separate. So that aggressively determined part object is also there and can be projected at times. Well, it could be onto a video game character or somebody else in the environment. The individual, I mean, like not in this particular movie, but I mean, like here it was about a video game, but it could be that the person goes to school, university, class, work, and then suddenly it's got that aggression toward a colleague, and then that is part of that being projected. At times, it's really the inner world being projected onto somebody else. So I think at least this is one way to look at that. Not always. I mean, like I always say that we have to look at it through a biopsychosocial lens. Some people in our environment are actually aggressive, and some people actually are not nice. So I mean, like sometimes we've got colleagues or managers who are not nice people. I mean, like that I understand, but I'm saying that sometimes that's the psychological part. That's the projection of the person's own aggression, aggressively determined part object.
It also makes me think of Margaret Mahler and her theory about normal autism. And there's something a little bit autistic about this film and about the character, where again, it's an inner bubble that he lives in, or attempts to create or stay in. And what allows us, as we grow as individuals, we go from this normally autistic phase, sort of like a human in an egg shell, and we need aggressive drives to break out of the eggshell and to go encounter the outside world and the reality principle. So aggressive drives are not bad. On the contrary, they're part of life drives. We need them because that's when we have to break away. We have to break away to differentiate. So going back to what Rhett was saying in terms of object relations, we have to, we start in life being psychically attached and one with the mother. And we have to break away from that in order to construct our own specific identity. That requires some form of aggressiveness, which is very present in children when they start learning the ability to say no. And then they say no to everything. Even if they want something, they'll still say no just because they've discovered that they can. And that they are playing with their aggressive drives, which are necessary for them to construct their specific and separate identity from the one that they were fusioned with, that they were one with. But in our society, aggressiveness is not tolerated. We don't know what to do with it. When a child is being aggressive in kindergarten, let's say it's about that age group or before, even daycare, whatever, it is reprimanded and punished. So we learn very early on in our society that we are not allowed to be aggressive. Aggressive drives are assimilated with something that is bad. We'll have to do anger management, or we'll have to do all of this. So in fact, in the film, maybe the video character that's insulting him is making him go get those aggressive drives and insult him back, because that is his way out. And we could perceive it like that because the little character says, okay, now I'll show you the way out. So what is the way out? The way out is probably towards individuation, which means towards finally creating and being his own self, which is done only through those aggressive drives that we tend to reprimand. So we haven't really found an answer to what do we do about our destructive drives or our aggressive drives. And that sort of, Freud wrote about all this in Malaise dans la civilisation. I forget what the title of that in English is.
Civilization is discontent.
Yes, thank you.
Content, yeah.
And the fact that our civilization requires us to sublimate these drives, to transform them, to do something with them. And again, does virtual reality allow that to happen? Or can we go through the process of sublimation and transformation of our destructive and aggressive drives through all of this virtual experiences? Does it work?
What I'm wondering is that even if that is a possibility, what makes that, like virtual reality, a better choice than symbolization through arts, like painting, music, cinema? I mean, like so many different forms of art. So is the tendency toward virtual reality video games just because more money is spent buying them, purchasing the products, or is it really something that is as good as art? So that's something that I've been wondering.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the essential question is right there. The film I would tend to interpret the film as giving us an indication towards no, it does not. Sublimation work if it's virtual? Does the creative process allow the transformation of all these drives to sublimate, to symbolize and sublimate through whatever is virtual? I think that maybe the creator of the video games and such, but probably not the users.
I can't imagine putting the user or the consumer and the person who's actively creating something with their mind or their hands, or what you call sublimation and different artistic activities. It seems to me the user is lobotomized and is when we hear of all these children that have ADD and they're given medicine to calm their minds, and it seems that they're giving them video games to also calm them and to give a break to the parents so that the parents can go get on their phones and go on Tinder, try to find somebody else. It's the whole, nobody is being creative in the sense of what you call sublimation, which is making something out of
Something
nothing.
to say about that little figure in his game that insulted him and asked to be insulted back in order to find the way. And I looked at it as sort of like he was in a regression mode, and that he went towards his stage of like I want to say toute puissance, but that's French.
Yeah, almightiness.
The almightiness, and it was really representative and symbolic of kind of a kid anger that he still had inside of him. And it was kind of goofy in a way. He laughed at this figure and was surprised. And it was sort of the beginning of him going back there and then kind of renouncing that insulting someone and then finding the way. I felt that it was Samantha's voice was sort of a pacifier too, in another sense.
Pacifier, that's a good word. Yeah.
And she started to even go into his mind and take certain expressions and make them, his desires of his ex-wife. She was able to, I don't know, through letters or however she did that. And she became everything to him. So he didn't want for anything. His desires were sort of just all around him. He was living in sort of a stifled, his desires were stifled. They just stayed inside of him. And maybe that little figure was, for me, it was like he had to go back there to refine that kid anger. Maybe it had been kind of inert inside of him once again, is the way I looked at it.
Yeah, I think actually the two, what Christo and Maureen say actually are sort of like linked in the sense that Samantha played a very important role connecting the creator and the user. So the way I look at it is that if the video game player is just merely a user, yeah, I mean, like as you said, totally agree with you, Christo. It doesn't really work that much. It's just like for the parents to enjoy their time on their phones, probably, because in the nurturing setting, the parents or the main caregiver, whoever that is, has got to sit with the child, not necessarily giving him or her the answers, but like helping the child in the process of, say, putting together a puzzle if they're working together. So it's not getting angry and say, okay, you do it on your own, I don't know, come on, or just like, I do this for you, but just like helping. So then that could be helpful in the process of growth. And that is in a way what Samantha does in here. So she enters in, she becomes that main caregiver, maybe like good enough mother at that point for this adult, trying to help him make that puzzle, putting it together, not always giving him all the answers. He's got to figure it out on his own. But she is there always to help him. And then little by little, he can become more independent. So that's like a mother substitute for a while. So if that is the case, so even if when I was thinking about what you said about video games, so if video games are used like that, probably the user can also help, meaning that, okay, the child plays, the parent can also play, they can talk about the figures, they do something together in a way. So that might be nurturing. But as you said, I mean, like just saying that, okay, you play your video games, don't get angry, don't shout, don't do anything, we're going to do our thing. That's not helpful.
I kind of disagree with that in terms of the film, because Samantha, well, at least on this example, when she's the one who collects all of his writings, all of his fictitious correspondence, and turns it into a book, contacts the editors, publishers, and does it all for him. Do you remember? And so
in
here,
that sense, yeah, that's right.
she becomes the mother who sees the child being frustrated with the puzzle and does the puzzle for him. In the examples of the three mothers that Bion describes in the capacity of the mother to contain, there's the mother who gets angry at the child because he can't figure it out, and there's the mother who just is irritated by his inability to do it, so does it for him. And then there would be the good enough mother, and she's the one who just encourages him. And I think that that's really interesting what you're bringing up, though, the fact that all of these tools, these cyber tools, and even metaverses and all of that, could, if they are tools to assist, great. But then when they start to replace the actual experience, then it becomes destructive and regressive.
And I totally agree with that part. I mean, what I was referring to was the initial part of like Samantha appearing in his life. In a way, I was thinking that, okay, so this guy is actually at least interacting with someone. There is some sort of conversation that goes on like more than one sentence or 2 or 3 sentences. So that was all I was thinking, but I totally agree in terms of publication and collecting these works.
You're talking, I don't have the references. You're making me want to read some books. Good Mother, Good Enough. I don't know. I don't understand all these references. But so Samantha gives him confidence, reassures him. There's the sexual side, and then there's the maternal side, and then the day he finds out that he's not the only child, the only lover, and that she has 800 other people that she's doing the same, he breaks up with her. He freaks out. Is that something that in your research you find out that is like the arc of childhood going into maturity, and you break off from the mother and you can fly with your own wings? Is that sort of those kinds of symbols?
Yeah, it's the Oedipus complex.
Oops. I was going to say, like, Christo, actually, this is something that also happens in the clinical work. I mean, some patients really, really, really get angry when they learn that their psychoanalyst or therapist has got other patients.
Yes, that's a good
I mean,
point.
like, probably if you ask the person would say, yeah, I know there are other patients, but I mean, like, that's not, like, there is this split between the intellectual understanding and the emotional level understanding. So emotionally, the person really doesn't want to feel that he or she is the only one.
Yes, but that is because when they are in analysis, they are regressing to that binary relationship and entertaining the fantasy, the emotional fantasy that they benefit from an exclusive relationship. And then that's why I brought up the Oedipus complex, because until you discover the other, and the other is what actually turns you away from the mother, and then that's where you start to find new identification processes, and that's when everything else sort of goes towards growth.
I believe it's at the end of the movie that there was a quote. I kind of jotted it down because I felt it was really symbolic and very representative of the film. It's, the heart is not like a box that you fill up. The heart expands, and the more it expands, the more you love. And I felt like, you know, everything was in a box in this movie. And when he destroys the box and goes to that place, then he became himself. He became real.
Yes, that's when he's going through the disillusionment of these idealized objects and fantasies, moving away from the narcissistic identification. It's growth. It's going towards individuation, having resolved the castration complex, going through the Oedipus complex, going into individuation. So, Christo, you're saying that Spike Jonze is interested in psychoanalysis. Would you believe that he's gone through the understanding of these things that we're saying and set up the characters, the setting, everything accordingly, or are we just seeing things out of nothing?
I'm sure it's very well researched. He's the other films he did were with Charlie Kaufman, who's a script writer and also known for his psychological research and study of the human psyche, and then twisting and then approaching it from a different angle, which makes them interesting as filmmakers. What I was relieved was that this film does not end up with a moral Hollywood sort of happy ending. It just it makes us think through the state of humans today and our society with a little bit of hope. The hope is he connects to another human being. But it all makes us think, and especially with what's going on these days with ChatGPT and AI and how we're bombarded with a possibility of replacing humans in so many different aspects of our daily life. It's an important subject. And this film was done a while ago, wasn't it? This is a 10-year-old film.
This progress, this unlimited progress, technology is totally disregarding the fact that as humans living in a civilization, we require the actual experience of things and people. It cannot substitute. I was reading about AI replacing a long list of professions, such as lawyers or doctors, but they need to exist. They exist as people, not just as functions. And it's like we've forgotten that there's something essential to our stability, to our internal and mental stability, to have actual experiences with actual other human beings. It's not just their function. We exist beyond just a purpose of productivity, but there's something about our instinct that necessitates actual interaction and actual experiences that cannot be replaced.
That also exists in the field of mental health. I'm sure you may have heard of like various software or programs, chatbots and things like that do some sort of therapy. I have a part-time calling it therapy, so you can just sit down, chat, and then sometimes there is another person chatting again. It's typing, it's not that kind of thing, but then there are sometimes like computer produced responses, and that's exactly what you were saying. So I mean, like it's not that human interaction. There is no subjective connection in that. It's just like as if there are those responses depending on some objective criteria are predetermined. So okay, so this is the problem, this is how you feel, so you feel like that, and so on and so forth. Whereas when we are sitting here and talking about the topic, whatever the topic is, it could be this movie, it could be alienation, it could be depression. I mean, millions of things are going through our minds. I mean, including what we know, the books we've read, the experiences each of us has had. And then that is a real interaction, which it does not happen there when we're like chatting with a computer bot.
Let me, just for the sake of it, challenge you. If the computers read all the books you've read and more, the chat bot will be able to give you the response, just like everybody is self-medicating with the internet and looking up what they should eat and what vitamins they should take. Is there a moment when you think, in your position, the four of you, that ChatGPT may be replacing therapists and people who can help you think things through? because they've read the same books you have?
Well, they don't have the same personal experiences that I have. And then being in therapy or in psychoanalysis is not like playing a piece of music someone else or myself have composed before. It's like improvisation. I mean, I don't know what comes up. I mean, let's go there and let's play. So that's how it works. So even if that person has got like all the music, all the notes, but I mean, I don't know what the other musician would play at that given point in time. So I may want to play something else. So that's the way I look at it. So I look at it as an art, and so that's why I see it as there is no end point. It's like learning an art, a musical instrument, or a new language. You can never say that, well, I know it all. It's like saying that, okay, I've read all the books in the world, but still there is more.
So in a way, I'm obviously I agree with you, and in a way, it's the human error that makes the intelligence, and it sort of relates to the Japanese kintsugi, which the art of fixing something with gold. The cracked bowl is not perfect until it's broken and fixed with gold leaf, and that's what makes the beauty. It's the experience. It's the adding the human flaws that then will make it. So you guys are off the hook. You don't have to be threatened by ChatGPT for a while, I guess.
This when Freud explains what psychoanalysis is to the scientific community, trying to establish why psychoanalysts cannot have a scientific way of thinking. So it cannot be a mathematical, objective practice. It is totally subjective and dependent on the experience, the emotional experience of a moment at a specific moment with two specific individual subjectivities. So impossible to artificially create. It's not possible.
See what you mean, Cristobal. I mean, like some may do that. I mean, in terms of schools of psychology, behaviorists may think that they are very objective, they can measure behaviors. But for me, I mean, as a person that studied psychology, I say that the name of our discipline is psychology, and behaviorology is a psychology without the psyche. We need psyche in the psychology. So then that is subjective.
This was a very interesting conversation. Thank you, everyone, for being able to tolerate the frustration of sitting behind your screen and conversing. And have a good day for Canada and good rest of the afternoon for all the Europeans.